to write about musicians that have come before us and have been in very similar situations. It all comes down to the ability to articulate what that means. Like, so, I mean, you know, like some of the writers I most admire, like Peter Grolnick, for example, he's more of a traditional biographer and a music fan, but I don't think he's a musician at all. So, but he's a masterful storyteller and researcher and a writer. So I think for me, it's like, well, here I've been in a studio, even back in the old days when they were really studios, and not that they've changed drastically, but back when that.
Well, they have and they haven't, right? I mean, there are still those traditional studios, but obviously there are different models now.
Whatever the thing might be, cutting tape, whatever it is. But it's more about the dynamics and arrangements and listening deeply to things. But also, like, what does being in a band mean? What does it mean to be an artist? What does it mean to be like a songwriter, a band leader, navigating that kind of stuff? So I think without a doubt that I bring some I wasn't going to say authority, but let's just say experience. I don't know about authority, but experience there.
I would say authority. I think authority is right. I like to tell myself that I write professionally, and that in some of the things that I write that maybe sometimes there's value in not being an expert and really kind of approaching it from the outside and sort of learning about a thing.
Beginner's mind. Yeah.
Yeah. A little bit Alan Watts, a little bit Zen, and learning about it, as you're writing about it, gives an on-ramp to the reader, something that you have to be mindful of.
Yeah. I was just going to say there's a downfall to it. It's a downside as well, which is like not assuming everybody knows what the hell you're talking about. So, on my previous Stones book, I remember having a back and forth with my editor about, she's like, you're geeking out a little bit too much about the gear or whatever it might be. And I said, yeah, that's a good point. But I know that certain people want to hear about certain things and how the gear affects things. And what I try certainly not to do is get too bogged down in like music theory, because even as a musician of 30, 40 years, whatever, I've been playing my whole life, actually, I've been playing music. And I used to read music when I was a kid, but I get really turned off when people start to use musical theory terms, and I have to remember, whoa, what does that mean? I mean, a glissando is one thing, but if you're talking about like a flatted fifth or something, it gets a little too inside baseball and technical.
It's minutia, and again, I think it's something that any expert in a given field has to be mindful at the end of the day. I mean, this is a general audience book.
Exactly. Yeah.
It's a book for people who like music, but it's not necessarily a book for musicians.
No, but at the same time, I do want to make musicians really appreciate it, because sometimes things are just written so dumbed down, for lack of a better term. That's probably not the best term for it, but like just bringing it down to basic layman's terms, or writing things about musicians without writing about the music enough. So I also want this to appeal to musicians, and I know it is, especially the musicians that are in the book, to really know that they are appreciated in what they did from a music, because that's what it's about. It's like, what makes this guy distinctive is not just his enigmatic personality, and his mystery, and his life, but it's the fact that he was a musician. I mean, that was his thing. It was 90-something% of his identity, I bet. So, yeah, it's a little bit of a balance for sure.
That's an interesting point, and something I haven't considered. I mean, obviously, Leon will not, unfortunately, be reading this book, but there's a decent chance that the hundreds, I guess, of people you spoke to about it, that at least a few of them are going to pick it up and read it at some point.
Oh, many of them have. I mean, I sent it to many of them, and some of them had picked it up before I could send it to them. And I haven't had any blowback yet. I'm always sort of flinching whenever I send anything out in the world. But yeah, it means the most to me that the people generally the people that I interviewed for the book, feel I got him right. Particularly that the musicians who collaborated with him feel I got it right. And then there's this other audience of musicians generally, and people that just want to read about a good hero of theirs. I want to appeal to all those people, of course, but there's sort of layers of like, I'm glad that the guy, Jack Wessel is bass player for the last half of his life. I'm glad that he feels I got it right. I'm glad Claudia Lanier called me this weekend and told me I got it right. Those kinds of people.
What does it mean to get him right?
Well, I think speaking to 130-ish, 140 people I talked to, it kind of gives you, you've got to listen to everybody's stories, and you get this Rashomon effect, right? So that you can get like 4 or 5 people in the same incident telling you different versions of that thing. And I mean, I can't remember 10 years ago, never mind 40 years ago, if I was around for that long and an adult. So it's amazing that the people remember what they do, but you start to remember things in your own sort of cemented version of reality, which may have been enhanced or changed over the year, and then it starts to solidify. But I'm sort of more struck by how many people sort of tell the same story in a similar way, so that you get a pretty good picture of reality. Anything that seemed questionable to me, I either questioned and verified, or I questioned and left out, especially if it was something controversial. But yeah, I think getting somebody right is like, who knows? I never met Leon. I don't know what he was like as a person, aside from all these other voices painted a picture. And when there's a consistent picture, you're, give or take a margin of error, you feel like you kind of got him right.
There's this idea called triangulation, and it's something that that we use a lot in technology, and effectively it's, if you get enough points around to give an object, you're able to identify it or identify where it is, and that's sort of what you have to do, right? Is you have to figure out that middle point.
Correct. Yeah, and without watering it down, like you don't want to throw out some of the more jagged edges just because you don't have, it depends on what we're talking about, I suppose. But yeah, that's for sure. The more people that are in the room that tell a very similar story, that's the story. And there may be, and you may, for me, I may quote somebody saying, well, and this plus this, and it may be sort of a little bit of gravy, but they're saying it. I don't know if, how true or not true something might be there. But I think you get over, 500 plus pages, you get an overall pretty good view of the guy. I certainly I can't imagine I didn't get a couple things wrong, but I haven't heard many things yet, honestly, but it's only been a couple weeks.
Any really well-known musical figure, him especially, becomes mythical over time. And it's your job to sort of to peel back those myths.
That's interesting. I just had this conversation with somebody else who's somewhat involved in Leon's legacy. And there is a question of like, well, must you peel back myths, or do you actually lean into the myths, in storytelling? And for example, in that conversation that I had just had, it's like I brought up Nick Tosh's book of about Jerry Lee Lewis, which I love, Hellfire. But how much of it's true and how much of it's just, it's written like a novel. And I think a bit of it's, you don't need to make Jerry Lee Lewis's life in any way fantastical because it was so fantastic as it was. The truth of it, like, you don't need to enhance it. But, it's like, which choices do you leave out? Which boring parts do you leave out to make it a really exciting book? And Leon's not like Jerry Lee Lewis that way, but he's like Jerry Lee Lewis in as much as he could walk into a room and Mick Jagger would feel that this guy is like a rock star, charismatic figure that filled with mystery. And I know that for a fact. And so do I make somebody more boring by making them more human? I don't think so. I think you get this picture of this guy who is maybe that much more of a great mythical figure because he was also human. Like you talk about, in Greek mythology, the human aspects of those gods, for example, like that's what makes them identifiable.
Very similar human aspects as the kinds that Jerry Lee Lewis had at the end of the day when you think about it. I don't have the Jerry Lee Lewis book, but I have his, I have Nick Tosh's Dino book. His Dean Martin book, and I think it's similar in that. And the difference, I think, I've never talked to him, but the impression that I get from him and his writing is that there's there's an extent to which he considers himself a novelist.
Right. Well, kind of it's like,
it's literature.
Yeah. It's creative nonfiction. It's literature. Yeah. And I aspire to that. I guess if I could write more novelistically like that, I might. But with this book in particular, I just felt like this is the way it's unfolding, and I kind of went with the flow on it. I didn't want to force some sort of approach onto it. But Tasha's, I read both of those books, and I think Dino, it paints more of Hellfire is more of a quick sort of burst of like just nonstop energy. Whereas Dino is more that languid, because that fits his personality. And I forgot the word they kept using. And Tasha's uses it. It's a certain Italian word about this sort of louche figure. Anyway, these are choices you make, I suppose, when you're writing.
Yeah, it's what the kids call vibing.
Okay,
you're vibing. You're capturing the feel of a character, and at a certain point, perhaps the minutia doesn't matter.
Yeah, and part of it's like how much quoting do you use from the sources as opposed to paraphrasing. And with this book, I found myself just, especially when it came to something controversial. Of course, it just takes the weight off me and the burden off me to just say, well, this is so and so saying this. But the voices that I interviewed, almost all of them were so compelling that I wanted their manner of speech and not just their viewpoint. And the more you do that, the less it becomes a novel. And I wanted it to, I didn't want it to get to be an oral history, but there's that spectrum of like, pure narrative to oral history. And I hopefully I'm right in that right balance there as well.
Do you get the sense from him, or I suppose the people that you talk to, that he played a role in propagating those myths?
Yeah, my sense is that he was unaware of his innate charisma early on. More than one person said he was a rock star before he was a rock star. And I also take that to mean that he didn't know he was a rock star before he was actually a rock star. And in fact, a couple of people talk about like Chris O'Dell, for example, his girlfriend who came back from London with him after he's making that debut record. He records that, puts it mostly in the can, and comes back to LA with her, taking her from Apple Records. And she talks about like his awakening to how he saw himself, because it was right after the Mad Dogs tour, how he saw himself appealing to particularly women. But like earlier on, like he would come into a studio as a session guy, and he wouldn't say a word. He would just do his job. But he had such a mastery as a musician, and particularly with his sense of time. Hence his nickname, Master of Space and Time. But he could really kind of, as Herb Alpert said, he wouldn't know what he was doing right away. He wouldn't have a part in mind, and then all of a sudden the whole band would be following him. So that all kind of paints this picture of this guy that was such a master. And it's sort of like the being there phenomenon. It's like, the less you say, or the more obscure you are in saying it, the more people ascribe certain meaning to it. And I think that with his appearance, with his limp, it all sort of made up for this very enigmatic guy with a very calm, quiet charisma, but who became aware of it and then had to overcome his shyness and insecurity and all that stuff. And he puts on this gigantic rock star persona, which was like a super kind of Nova thing it was a real persona that he adopted. And that was yet another layer of charisma. That was more like the televangelist persona.
He certainly dressed the part. He almost had a costume. Then that goes along with the myth making at the end of the day.
Yeah. I mean, Rita Coolidge told me, and she said it in her book as well, that, when she saw Leon coming into the A&M parking lot for the Mad Dogs and Englishmen tour, he's got the top hat, he's got these certain clothes that he's chosen, sort of super hippie clothes, basically from it's 1970, and he's strutting. And she said he was never a strutter. He was always he could either be Mr. Personality or he wouldn't get out of bed for 3 weeks. So it was this sort of bipolar personality that she describes. But she said putting on that top hat, it was always sort of like the Frosty the Snowman. He puts on this top hat, or this, he's like Superman. He puts on a cape, and he becomes that persona.
You just referenced, and in other interviews, I've heard you reference the Mad Dogs and Englishmen, the Joe Cocker live album. Why was that such a, if not turning point, it really seems to be the album or the time period that really, I think, solidified your feelings about him or your appreciation of him as a musician?
Well, I mean, for a long time, that was my only real impression of him. I was 6 when Tightrope came out, and I was, 6 years old. I was just in love with AM radio, and I probably had my own little transistor radio at that point already. And that was a big hit when I was 6 or so. And that was it. But when I was 12, and I grew up with the Carpenters in my house. My mom was a big Carpenters fan. So I knew Superstar, I knew A Song for You, This Masquerade. I know all that stuff. 76, George Benson comes out with his version of This Masquerade, but I don't know if I had drawn the line between all those things in Leon. But then I got Mad Dogs English. Well, specifically, a friend of mine had it. And just there are certain times when you're in your development where certain records just come to you when they're supposed to. And Exile on Main Street was like that for me. But there was something about back then, I'm talking about the 70s and early 80s, where, I would get lost in these double albums. I was just such a music fan that the more of it, the better. So opening up Mad Dogs and Englishmen, seeing that artwork, seeing these figures, these people living together, the repertoire that kind of solidified that idea, this cosmic sort of hippie consciousness, these rock stars all hanging out together, touring together, this big, gigantic family band. There's dogs, there's kids. That just was like such a magical thing to me. Never mind the fact that the music was everything I loved about rock and roll, which I don't think I necessarily would have been able to articulate as a 12 or 13-year-old. I know I wouldn't have been, but it was really that soul and R&B and gospel shit that really appealed to me. So even within the Stones, like I love early Stones, I love later Stones, but man, that early 70s, let's say 68 to 72, that is just gold to me. And so much of that was actually literally influenced by Leon Russell. So, I mean, a lot of this is going back in time. Like I didn't grow up, like I was the oldest of 5. My parents were not particularly hip at all. So we didn't have Leon Russell records at the house, but I had Mad Dogs and Englishmen. It was just a constant in my life. And then, but just like going back as a musician and going, oh, now I'm drawing this line to this person, to this. Talk to Bobby Keys for the Stones book. He's talking about Leon Russell and all that stuff. Sort of like, oh, what an appealing figure.
This is where we get into kind of our old man talk, but the discovery is really interesting, and it was a really exciting element. Still exists to a certain extent, but pre-internet, of being a detective, getting really into music, and starting to connect the dots is very exciting.
Yeah, and taking that further, when the internet first did start to come around, and allmusic.com, for example, and those kinds of things came around, I loved being able to go into credits and click that credit and seeing what else had opened. And I still, now as a biographer and writer of music, it just makes my life, I can't imagine doing a project like this without that sort of resource, But yeah, there was something magical about just opening up. I know it's cliche, but it's like to sit there staring at an album cover for an hour while you listen to the music front to back on headphones, is an immersive experience. And Leon Russell, I saw that name on Let It Bleed. Okay. Oh, wait a minute. Leon Russell wrote this song that my mom's listening to. Oh, this Donny Hathaway song is written. So that stuff that like those eureka moments are great. It's what makes being a music fan so fun.
If I had to draw a line between him as a performer and Exile, versus a lot of the people who covered his songs, I mean, all love in the world for Karen Carpenter and the Carpenters, but they were very polished, a lot of those records, and he was raw underneath it all. And that, to me, obviously the early Stone stuff was raw out of necessity, but Exile was such a deliberately raw record.
Yeah, but more importantly, it really upped the gospel game for those guys. They had been raw almost all the way through. They had really never, even when they were doing psychedelia, they were raw. But they really kind of returned to their roots in a big way on Beggar's Banquet in '68. but then they come to L.A. and it really is Leon, not just his little piano part, which is significant on Live With Me, but he brought in Bobby Keys. He brought in Mary Clayton. This is sort of some of this stuff is not really told because they were going to bring in Bonnie Bramlett. These are all people from Leon's stable. He had already been doing session work in L.A. for like 7 years at that point, which is, in a young man's life, that's everything. And it really set the Stones. I think the Stones were already on that trajectory without a doubt. I mean, you listen to Nicky Hopkins, and for an English guy, he can really, back then, even before Leon, he could play gospel pretty effectively and pretty authentically. But I think they looked at Leon as like the real deal, which he was. But Leon didn't grow up in the church any more than Nicky Hopkins did. He grew up in a Methodist church, but he had these ears and he had the American vernacular down, and he had the experience of working with a lot of these people, including Aretha. So, but the Stones were sort of looking to capture, I think, some of that authenticity. I mean, kind of going early on, back when they started first going to Chess, and then RCA. And so they really wanted American. They really wanted to sound like real, American roots guys. So, yeah. And, but it was really from Let It Bleed to Sticky Fingers to Exile. You can just see this increasing gospel specific thing, not just R&B, not just soul, not just, it's like, wow, let's really lean into this gospel piano and Billy Preston organ and these singers that grew up in the church, that kind of stuff.
I'm glad you bring up Mary Clayton. She was on the show, I think last year or the year before.
Oh, wow.
And, she invariably tells the Give Me Shelter story, wherein she's basically gets a call in the middle of the night. Her husband convinces her to go to the studio. She's like 7 months pregnant. She records, she's singing rape and murder over and over again, doesn't know what to make of it. And then at a certain point, and it's still very clear on the record, her voice cracks. And she says, oh, my voice cracked. Let's do it again. There was a mistake on there. And it was kept on record. And that's a very deliberate decision. And I think that speaks to that attempt to really capture authenticity.
Yeah, and the rawness, as you say. I mean, that is one of the great moments of emotion on record. And I wrote about it in depth. And I talked to her for the Rocks Off book, the Stones book, in 2013, and I said, it sounds like you felt it crack a little bit before that, and when it came back around, you actually lean into it. And she affirmed that, but I don't know if she's just sort of going along to sort of like make me, as it kind of goes back to the beginning of the conversation, is she just leaning into the mythology of it all? But to me as a singer, okay, so now we're give you an example of like where musicianship comes in and experience. Like, are you there? There you went. Yeah. Yeah. So, I mean, just bringing a musician's background and a studio background, it's like you hear something like that, as you say, it kind of sounds like almost a mistake, but I could feel her feeling her vulnerability and like pushing it even harder, because if your voice breaks like that, your inclination is to either stop and clear your throat and say, hold on, let me, or lean into it even more and go, wow, I'm going to make this next one crack even more and make it hit you in the gut, and that's what it felt like to me. At least that's what I want to believe.
You allude to that Stones book, which I think is effectively an attempt to draw sort of a broader narrative through the stories of these songs, to use the songs as a kind of a jumping off point to tell the story of the Stones. And then the 33 and a third book, obviously very different. That's hyper-focused in a way that a lot of these sort of broader biographies aren't. The approach to this, by the nature of the kind of book that you wanted to write, had to be dramatically different, I think, than both of those. Yeah,
I mean, this is a biography, so yeah, the first Stones book is just very heavy on the point of view about Exile on Main Street. I did some interviewing, I did a lot of research, but a lot of it was just kind of based on existing source material and my opinions on stuff and why, and an appreciation, really an appreciation. The second Stones book was kind of the same thing, but now taking it over their whole career. I did a little bit more in the way of interviewing, but I'm still not necessarily a journalist or a biographer at that point. I'm using the existing biography as far as I know it. But then this one was just straight up biography, and really very little source material existed except for, periodicals and online stuff. I mean, there were no real books. I mean, no real books about him, There's one actual book that a guy put out that kind of came out around the same time that I was winding down my manuscript. In fact, I think I was on the second draft. And he just self-published it, and it's called The Superstar in a Masquerade. It kind of covers Leon and J.J. Cale. His name is William Sargent. It was a self-published, a real big project. It took him like 25 years but it's more of a compendium and an encyclopedia of things. He calls it a biopedia. So it's not a real book so much as a great reference thing, but he really did his research. So I don't want to throw him under the bus. I mean, it was helpful to me to kind of go back and go, oh yeah, so we have the same recording dates here. He's got this. Oh, he added this one. I don't have that one. I wanted to confirm, that kind of thing. You
obviously talked to some really huge people for this book. How long of a process was it beginning to end?
It's like during the pandemic, so I lost sense of all time. But it started spring of 19. I talked to Jan, Leon's widow. And then it went from there. So it was really it was basically really a good solid 2 years, if not a little bit more.
In a certain sense, this was kind of a perfect pandemic project.
PPP.
It prohibited your movements, and I'm sure that there's a lot of things that, that maybe you would have done that you weren't able to do. But all of a sudden, we've all got a ton of free time on our hands.
Yeah, I mean, it was important for me, obviously, to have some free time. I didn't have as much free time as I had anticipated because of my day job, actually, which is selling real estate, actually turned into this crazy busy time. But I did have, all social time was gone pretty much. And I was home with the family like everybody else. But it was more importantly, the pandemic allowed, so you mentioned, a lot of these names, or the people that I interviewed, I think a lot of them would have been predisposed to talk about Leon and wanted to talk about Leon. But if they were out on the road or if they were in a studio, it would have been much more logistically challenged. But the fact that everybody was home and sort of used to being on Zoom calls and things like that, it greased the wheels pretty easily.
I've been doing the show for a while, and it used to be very important for me to do all of these in person. I've got like a little setup. I would either go to somebody, have them come to me. I felt like there was, this is why I use video. Obviously, it's just kind of an approximation, but there's something that you get actually being in front of somebody, them sitting across a table from you, sharing a space, being able to read body language. Were you concerned about that when you started?
Yeah, I mean, I definitely missed out on it. And in fact, I mean, I would say that if my memory serves, there are actually, I would say less than even half of the calls were even Zoom video calls. A lot of them were just straight up phone calls. I mean, there's pluses and minuses. I'm not a real journalist. I shouldn't even say I'm not a journalist. I just sort of, this is what my first project of doing this kind of thing. Never mind this many interviews. It became a real addiction to me. I'm not sure if you feel the same way. I mean, I became like, I bet you do. For me, it was like, I was really nervous those first few, especially back in the earlier books. But then I'm like, I'm going to be talking to Bruce Springsteen. I'm psyched to be talking to Bruce Springsteen. I can't wait. And then it's like, I wanted to talk to everybody. It wasn't just, I was excited to talk to everybody because I wanted to hear their stories. And I love to talk. I love to converse. I did have a few in-person interviews, and that came at the end of the project. And I was able to finally get out to Tulsa and go into these archives, which were not digitized. So thank goodness for that. At least the pandemic broke for that. I don't think I would have been able to honestly finish the book in the correct way if I had not had access to that kind of stuff. But a lot of it came like I did all this work and I was writing and interviewing and researching all at once. It wasn't like I said, okay, a year of research and then a year of writing. It wasn't like that. It was like, there were some people that come later in his chronology in his life that I said, hey, listen, I'm going to be reaching out to you. Just know that I don't want you to know that I don't want you to hear that I'm writing about you without me coming to you, but I need to know what I'm going to ask you by the time I get up there. So for me, it was a very linear process. But by the end of it, I was like, damn, I got to cram to get all this other. I mean, I literally spent like 5 days in Tulsa just taking pictures on my cell phone of, scanning documents and saying, I'll digest this stuff later and go through this later. I just needed to get it all captured so I could get home and write about it.
The Springsteen one is funny. I mean, obviously talk about towering mythical figures and somebody who I suspect, even again, having done a lot of these, that I'd feel nervous in the lead up to it. But the thing that you had that I don't have for this show is you had an in, you had a topic, and there's a sense in which that makes for a much easier interview because you're coming in knowing that that person agreed to do the interview because they want to talk about that thing.
Yeah, and my temptation that I have to watch is wanting to talk to them about other things. Like, I mean, certain people. All right, one of my great surprises in this is how great an interview Eric Clapton was, and
which, yeah, baggage is a word I would throw around with Clapton.
Yeah, and his and mine. I mean, like I grew up as a guitar player in the 70s, like like everybody else, going, okay, this guy. I mean, you have to remember the context for even in the 70s, you already remembered what that stuff meant in the 60s. And anyway, long story short, and he was going through his COVID anti-lockdown thing and controversial statements and he already had his baggage. But I said, so I called him up. I said, hey, hi, it's Bill Janovitz. Is Eric Clapton. Hey, it's Eric. I said, hey, Eric, how you doing? He goes, well, I'd be all right if it wasn't for all this bloody lockdown thing. So he sort of said it immediately, but then he got it out of the way. And then we talked for like an hour. So my point is that we ended up just shooting the shit about guitars and blah, 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 and music. And he really opened up. And the other things that made him surprising was I think he kept a diary because he has a really great memory and great insight. But yeah, guys like him, guys like Cheech Marin told me side stories that would never make it in the book because they have nothing to do with Leon. But stuff like that is just like if you talk to 140 people, you gotta like some of them, many of them, tell you all these great other stories, and they ask you questions, and then you get into a conversation. So my temptation was to not just be all Chris Farley on some of these people and go, Bruce Springsteen, you did Darkness on the Edge of Town, right? Awesome.
The Cheech Marin thing doesn't surprise me at all, knowing what I know about him, that he was going off on, on a lot of tangents. The Clapton thing is funny because, and I completely understand this, and, I don't know a lot about your politics. I suspect you probably don't agree with him on a lot of things, but you have to, you have to humor the person at first and listen to them and, and then find your way in.
Is that what you're doing with me?
We're going to talk about vaccines and autism in the bottom half of the interview.
Just humor me. Yeah, no, I mean, you just want to find common ground. And listen, I mean, we all have to find common ground with some of these edgier opinions.
I wasn't really very aware of it at the time, but I was going back and watching some of the live performances that you archived online. I mean, that was... When did that start? When was it? I guess when was it clear that one, that you were not going on the road anytime soon, and two, that you did have this avenue?
Well, we weren't going to go on the road anyway. I mean, the next thing for Buffalo Tom would have been to get into the studio, and we were kind of quite prepared to get that going. We had a lot of songs ready to go. So boo hoo hoo. I mean, everybody had their stuff, but I mean, Buffalo Tom has not been a full-time concern for a long time, so no big deal there. But yeah, I still play out around town personally, and Buffalo Tom still plays around town and various, sort of short jaunts. So, I mean, I played my last show before the pandemic that February. So the next month we were all shut down. And I don't know how far into it, but I think pretty soon into it, I figured it wasn't just me. Obviously, other people started live streaming, and some people had already kind of mastered it. Or gotten so for me, a lot of it was also the challenge of finding out how to do this kind of stuff, like make it sound as good as possible, and so it was really, people. It's really nice. Like I played 3 shows through the fall and winter this year, 3 or 4 shows, and everybody comes up to me. Well, I shouldn't say everybody, but so many people come up to me and tell me what that meant to them, and I was just so thankful that anybody was paying any attention whatsoever while they're thanking me. For me, it was like, hey, you're all locked down. What else are you going to do? I got a captive audience. We're performers, so we perform. But it really kept me sane because, number one, I'm playing and people are paying attention. But also there's this, I would go back and read the comments because it was a live chat going on or whatever. And that meant a lot to me to see all these people around the world, literally around the world, tuning in at a certain time and feeling this sense of community, which is what, it's sort of the best of the internet. There's so many horrible things about it, but that was sort of the utopian ideal back, I think, when people started to come up with this technology.
Yeah, I like that you use the phrase playing around town in reference to, I guess, the state that Buffalo Tom is in currently, because it sounds like it's low pressure, and low pressure seems like a nice place to be in for a band.
Yeah, when we were, it's funny. We watched that whole sort of Woodstock '99 thing came out recently. There was like 2 documentaries. I could only watch one, and that was a lot to get through. But that was like, oh yeah, that was '99. That was the year my daughter was born. That was the year Buffalo Tom got off the road. That was like, because everything was, we started in '86 to just kind of give you some context, right? And we got on the road by '88, '89. And so we rode that wave of like, our band could be your life. There was really very little chance of making it big. You just wanted to kind of see if you could put out another record and extend your adolescence another year or two. And then Nirvana happened, right? And it was sort of just like that. Nirvana, Pearl Jam, everything has, and then they're signing every band that, wears a flannel shirt and plays a guitar loud. And so we benefited from that to a great extent. But we rode that. It didn't sort of whatever. We didn't become as big as Pearl Jam or Nirvana. So it's like, it was quite clear that we could kind of keep doing it at this like sort of low level, not low level, but, a reasonable level, but we would have to stay on the road. And Tom, our drummer, had already had 2 kids. I had my first, and Chris would have 2 as well afterwards. So we were always probably level headed to a fault. And I think we could all see the writing on the wall and say, well, we're either going to kill each other if we do this and try to make a living at this continuing, or so let's just take a break and then we'll check in with each other. And the 3 of us are just, I'm the most amped up of the 2 of the other 2 of the 3 of us. And so I'm the one that's sort of like usually going, okay, what are we doing? And, everybody's, I don't mean to, we're all interested in doing this. And sometimes one guy will say, let's go into the studio and let's do this. So, but back then it was like, well, I think if you would ask any of us, we thought maybe we were breaking up, but we weren't really passionate enough about breaking up. It was like, well, we'll just go away for a while. Maybe we should have broken up, and maybe the reunion would have been as big as Pavement. Who knows? I doubt it. But it's. I think it's just nice to reconvene, but to make a living doing other things without having to put it all on music definitely takes the pressure off.
I spoke to Carl Newman last week from the New Pornographers, and they've been through a few members here and there. It's been fairly consistent, but he effectively said to me, no matter what people tell you when somebody leaves a band, it's not 100% amicable. and this is something that that I've heard from a lot of bands, and I understand it, right? I mean, I've always said the best way to test the strength of relationship is to move in with somebody. Being on the road in a van is 100 times that.
Yeah. I mean, and this is, again, this is where the insight comes in from my experience to looking at, let's say this book, but let's talk about specifically about Mad Dogs and Englishmen and like Joe Cocker and the struggle between Leon and Joe Cocker, which wasn't really a struggle because there was no outward struggle. It was all sort of passive aggressive, which is like, we majored in passive aggressivity in Buffalo Tom, there was never a moment where somebody was threatening to punch out the other guy. It was really like, okay, I haven't talked to that guy in 3 weeks, and I see him at sound check or whatever it is. And, that is like the experience of that is like, you have to say, okay, how old were we? We were in our 20s. We got out of college. We already had been friends in college, but we weren't like the best friends. We became sort of really great friends, and now we're family. But back then it wasn't like that. We became really good friends as we were doing it, but like we just happened to be in the same friend group. But then you're in this band and you're in your 20s and you're just trying to figure out this stuff. And it's a completely unnatural sort of like, like the real world. It's like, let's put a bunch of people in a house and see what happens. I mean, it's like, it's not the real world. It's being in a van and playing one-nighters in shitty clubs and having great moments, and then the most depressing moments you could have ever imagined, all sort of within a 12-hour span. Really kind of, you have to figure things out pretty fast, and you don't always do it elegantly.
You know, I implicitly understand what the great moments were, but what were the really shitty moments? What were kind of the, I guess, the ebbs in touring for you?
Well, I mean, there are funny stories about bad nights, but those aren't like the real ebbs, because at least they come out with a silver cloud of, ha ha ha, we still tell that story to this day. You know, we'll laugh about this someday, that kind of stuff. But then there are just moments that you just, well, for me, the lowest ebbs were just being alone for, you know, like, let's say we were in Australia, and you do like maybe a 2-week tour, but you would only play 4 cities maybe, and you'd play some of them twice and come back around, but you'd have a lot of downtime. And downtime to me really fucked with my head, because I was really lonely, and I missed my now wife. We were married in 92. So a lot of those years we were married, but we had been together since Buffalo Tom started. So we were extremely close, and she's my buddy. She was my best friend. And when you're on the road, you don't necessarily want to talk to other people. You don't want to be hanging out with each other all the time. But at the same time, I didn't do alone very well. I do it much better now. Sometimes I go away for 4 or 5 days and I'm happy. But back then, I was just like, all my thoughts and all my insecurities and everything would just start to become this big echo chamber in my head. And, you know, you didn't even have the internet to sort of go onto social media and vent or see other friends, and kind of, I think that would have been a benefit maybe. But I would just be walking these cities alone. And, you know, it made for great art sometimes. It really, but also it made for some horrible art. I mean, stuff that would never see the light of day, just like, you know, raw vein openings in a diary kind of stuff. But those were the ebbs. And then it was like, they were together and we're playing this great show at Sydney the next time. I use Australia as an example because I kind of remember couple of moments just walking for like 2 days.
And it's as far as you can get from your family and friends.
That's true too. There you go. But also like, I remember like the moment where I said, I think everybody went out without me, that kind of stuff. Like paranoia seeps in. I mean, you know, I struggled with my own sort of low level depression and anxiety like anybody else does, I suppose. And then you're never getting everybody else's personalities and what they're going through, and you personalize it. When you're in your 20s, it's all about you. Or at least it was about me.
When the pressure is off, the way you put it was that you got off the road. How does the art change?
Well, for me, I don't think the being on the road,
not the road necessarily, but the
off the treadmill,
and also the, you know, when you're in it, when you're in that period, when you're again, you didn't think you were superstars, but, you know, you're in it with the labels and everything else. The pressure is substantially different than when you decide, hey, this is kind of a fun thing that we're doing.
Oh, yeah. The lack of pressure. I don't know. I mean, I think let's put it this way. I think we were always buffered from any kind of commercial decisions from a label standpoint. Like we never had the label breathing down our necks until about that last record, which, you know, we had always been signed to pretty much our whole career. We had mostly been signed to Beggar's Banquet. We had signed to a Dutch label early on, and he still was involved with us, this guy. Rick, great guy, but horrible deal. But we signed to Beggar's Banquet, and we always were licensed out to major labels in the United States and to different, you know, different plans or whatever. It wasn't until our last Smitten record of the 90s, that we were signed directly to a U.S. major label. And mostly that was, as I recall, it was mostly my really pushing that idea of like, let's see if we can really kind of make a bigger push for commercial success. Maybe being on an indie label is holding us back, which was kind of stupid thinking, but maybe, you know, understandable. I don't know if staying with Beggar's Banquet would have gave us longevity, but it being on Polydor certainly ended our career pretty, you know, it made it a very good reason to stop, because they had told us before our record came out, look, there's a merger, Seagram's, blah, 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 they're taking over the, you know, you can either put the record out now or you can wait and see what happens afterwards. So let's get it out now, because we've heard too many horror stories of bands never having their record ever released. You know, we had spent so much time putting this record together and so much Sturm und Drang, and we had gone through different, you know, keyboard players, and we were like trying to make a different thing and just make it artistically kind of progressive record, but also I think there were commercial concerns. And that was from us. And then also from the label. But, they signed us to put out the record. Nobody knew it came out. Very few people knew it came out. They dropped us in 200 other acts or whatever it was, and they paid us to go away, which was a perfect time to go away because we got some money to go away and give us a little buffer. But to answer your question, I think coming back kind of still did a few things in the early 2000s, some A-sides and B-sides. And we had a hit record in England with a cover of the Jam song, Going Underground. I mean, literally a top 10 hit. But it was really coming back on, I think it's Skins. I think it was the first record back, maybe 3 Easy Pieces. Skins, yeah. And then by then it was like, yeah, we're getting back together because we want to be together. And we'll figure out who's going to put this out after. We were making enough money from gigs to, have a recording budget, and recording budgets were getting cheap. Yeah, but as far as the songs themselves, how does the pressure manifest or not in songs? I don't think it really ever affected us too much. Our songs, because you have to, when you think about songs and what those things, how they affect the art, you're really thinking about primarily lyrical content. And our lyrical content was always a pretty good mirror of where we are in our lives, I think, whether it was opaque or direct.
It must have been really edifying or encouraging to, as you said, go away and then just have this massive hit and make it clear that people still want what you're putting into the world.
Yeah, but but I mean, but it's such a typical thing, right? It's like like our friends Lemonheads had the big hit with their cover of Mrs. Robinson. For a band that's like writing and putting all these records out, it's kind of a backhanded compliment to have a hit record with.
That's fair. I didn't consider that, but that's totally fair.
Yeah, no. I mean, look, we were certainly happy, but it's like I didn't ever want to play that song again ever after that little tour we did on it, and it was only in the UK, so it didn't make us like set for life or anything. I don't know if we ever saw any money from it because you didn't write the song, so we didn't get publishing from it either. So, but it was nice to have it. Listen, to your point, it's nice to come back and do anything and have anybody pay attention. And Buffalo Tom has a diehard, really diehard core audience, sort of like Leon Russell did. People that will come out and they're actually eager to hear our next record, and they want to hear us do new songs, and they fly to New York to see us from other countries. It's very gratifying.
I wonder if your decision, whether subconscious or consciously, to sign to Polydor and kind of almost what seems from the outside to have been sort of like a last ditch effort to let's see if we can really make this work, that you had already sort of seen the writing on the wall.
Yeah, to some extent that's true. It was more like, it's this idea of moving goalposts. I always use this analogy. It's like I said, we were just happy to headline a club in Boston. We couldn't believe we could headline a club in London. And then you start doing better. And then you start seeing bands that are like you come and do even better than that. And then you start to measure yourselves against them. I'm only speaking for myself because I think the other guys in the band were always kind of happy to be where we were. And I was always, and I'm not saying that they're not ambitious. I just think that to a fault, at least let's say, measured our, this band opened up for us and they talked about us as an influence, and now they're selling out blah, blah, blah. And they're selling. Why are not we selling? Is our music that much more difficult? Is it like, why aren't we having a giant hit with this? But it's like, but if you had asked us in 86 or 89 when we were kind of getting going, it's like, the idea of having a quote hit would be, we would literally laugh at you. Like, no, we're just an indie rock band we're playing the basement bar. Like, but then the band I would go see in that bar were the Flaming Lips, and that was like what I aspired to be. And then the Flaming Lips became gigantic with a sort of novelty song. And they never looked back. They're like, and
became giant with like 2 novelty songs, spread like 15 years apart.
Yeah. But then there were bands that really worked really hard, like Wilco. They didn't have like a hit right out of the door. But he was always on the road with some version of that band, always putting out records and never sort of gave it up. It's kind of a lifer. And I feel like we kind of said, maybe it was me as much as anybody else or more so, like, I can't do this anymore. Whatever it was, I'm burned out.
I suspect it puts things into perspective, when he spent so long kind of attempting to exist in Leon Russell's head. The way you put it, I think it was in the preface, ahead of the Elton John's big boost to get him into the Rock Hall, was that he was, I think, stuck in a ditch in the highway of life. And seeing somebody like that who and I know is very talented, wrote like an incredible musician, great studio musician, wrote some really incredible songs, great performer, but that somebody like him at that level of talent could have also struggled for a long period. It puts it into perspective how much of this is also timing and luck.
Yeah, and personal choices. So a lot of the stuff I was just talking about with Buffalo Tom is like I kind of like I'm examining myself and who I was at that time and the rash sometimes decisions I might make and stuff about shooting myself in the foot, saying things I probably shouldn't have said, maybe take a breath, step back, all that kind of stuff.
Self-sabotage.
Yeah, and Leon was the master of not only space and time, but of self-sabotage. And I mean, that's one of the things that comes through with all these people you talk about, that I talk to rather, about how getting him right. But it's something that's both it's something you could think of as sort of a negative turnoff characteristic, but also like an admirable one because of his artistic integrity. Like, well, I mean, even Bruce Hornsby talks about it in the book. He's like, there's something that he wants Leon to correct. He says, well, no, sir, I think that would besmirch my artistic integrity of that take on a Picasso level. And Bruce says it with a real laugh. But I think that's just a small indication. But really, Leon wanted nothing to do with the music business aside from anything that was outside of his control. 100%. He wanted nothing to do with, and that extends all the way to like bookkeepers and touring agents, and like to his detriment. Like he, for example, he would have been better off if he got a professional bookkeeper that didn't embezzle from him, or he would have been and didn't get. Maybe he should have taken checks and not just cash, and maybe he should have paid his taxes on that, and maybe he should have gotten a booking agent that was just not his, dedicated just to him. Maybe he should have gotten one that with a good portfolio of artists where he could leverage those artists to get Leon on some good bills and things like that. Leon was always like, he just sort of, I think he felt like he was a know-it-all, or I think he thought he knew it all, or knew enough where he wasn't going to do certain things, to the point that this extends even beyond the Elton John thing, where Elton and his manager, Johnny Barbas, were not like just going to check this off on a to-do list of like making himself feel better, a repayment of a debt. He was really dedicated, Elton was, of overseeing Leon's career henceforth. Like, we're going to now hook you up instead of with T-Bone Burnett. Now we're going to maybe look at Don Was, and we're going to do this kind of record. And Leon's like, no, thank you guys. Thanks for getting me here, but I'm going back to what I was doing before. And he was just going back to his comfort level to some extent.
Is this a book that you could have written if he was still around?
That's a good question. I don't think so. I mean, it wouldn't be in this form. First of all, if he was still around and participated, I would have certainly more insight and it would be a different book. And if he was around and wouldn't participate, then that raises obviously a bunch of other controversial questions. First of all, his wife wouldn't have been cooperating with me, presumably, and his kids, and I might not have had access to documents. So, I mean, this is sort of a question that's in my mind now for my next project, whichever that might be, about like, well, what kind of project do you take on, and do you need access and cooperation from certain people? And, there's these schools of thought like, I think we all understand that a memoir is going to be very different than an unauthorized biography. But I think the best kind of biographies might be, I'm not saying mine is the best kind of biography, but I'm saying that the best of both worlds might be like Warren Zane's doing Petty, where you've got Petty alive, and he also sort of gives his blessing to just sort of do your book, Warren. But, I think he just asked for a look at it before it goes to press, just so he knows. He wasn't going to even ask for an edit, I think. And that's kind of the best, where you get the cooperation, you get access to the people. They're not shutting you off from certain people, but you're also left to do your own book.